The power of dignity and courage in the face of injustice. Welcome back to Life Tells Stories, where we share powerful tales that will challenge your views and inspire you to see life from different perspectives. Today, we have a truly shocking and heartfelt story that will make you question what true dignity and respect really mean. Have you ever thought about how far some people will go to maintain their pride and stand up for themselves, even when the odds are against them? Imagine an elderly woman being mistreated by the police, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Before we jump in, make sure to subscribe to Life Tells Stories and give this video a thumbs up if you find value in the courage and determination of our protagonist. We're here to uncover the truth, expose injustice, and provide life lessons that resonate. Two officers, Stephen and Jack, were out on their routine patrol, enjoying what seemed like a peaceful, sunny day. They drove down a quiet street, relaxed, with barely a person in sight. Out of nowhere, their attention was drawn to an elderly woman. She moved slowly, limping with evident difficulty, as if she was carrying an invisible burden. For Stephen and Jack, it was an unusual sight, and instead of being concerned, they found it amusing. They watched her stumble, and their curiosity turned into cruel fascination. They didn't stop to ask if she needed help. Instead, they mocked her movements. "Look at her, staggering as if she's carrying the weight of the world," Jack commented, and both officers chuckled at her expense. Their laughter was far from harmless. It showed a deep disregard for an elderly person's dignity. This scene quickly shifted from a peaceful day to the beginning of an outrageous incident. The peacefulness of the day stood in sharp contrast to what was about to unfold. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, but the ugliness of the officers' actions darkened the whole atmosphere. It was a day that should have been filled with kindness, yet it was quickly overtaken by callousness and a complete lack of empathy. The elderly woman, named Margaret, was visibly confused. Why were these police officers laughing at her? Margaret had no idea what she could have done to attract such disdainful attention. She had simply been walking, trying to get home, each step already a challenge due to her age and frailty. The officers continued to laugh, their voices dripping with ridicule, and each word wounded Margaret's pride. She felt belittled, disrespected, and above all, powerless. At that moment, all she wanted was to be treated like any other human being, with just a little bit of compassion and respect. But their cruelty only grew, and with each second that passed, Margaret's sense of helplessness transformed into anger. The pain was not just physical, it was emotional. Every laugh, every mocking word from Stephen and Jack was a stab at her dignity. Margaret had faced many challenges in her life, but she had always stood tall. Now, these two officers, in their indifference, made her feel small and vulnerable. The look of confusion in her eyes turned to one of determination. She wasn't going to allow this mistreatment to continue without standing up for herself. Despite her vulnerability, Margaret was not one to back down. She gathered all the courage she could muster. "Why are you laughing at me?" she asked, her voice trembling but laced with determination. "What have I done to deserve this?" Her question hung in the air, but instead of offering an answer, Stephen and Jack just laughed harder. They saw her defiance as humorous. How could this frail old woman possibly stand up to them? Margaret, however, knew better than to let them go without demanding answers. She raised her voice louder, her words full of indignation. She told them they had no right to treat her this way. And though her body was frail, her spirit was anything but. She was not about to be intimidated by men who thought they were above treating others with dignity. Margaret remembered the many battles she had fought throughout her life. She had faced hardships, financial difficulties, and loss, but nothing had ever shattered her willpower. Her life had taught her that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to grow. That was why, no matter how fearful she might have felt, she knew she had to speak up. Instead of realizing their mistake, the officers grew more aggressive. Stephen smiled a cruel smile, and told Margaret to back off or face consequences. Jack accused her of lack of respect. An irony, considering how little respect they'd shown her. "You keep this up, and you might just find yourself under arrest for harassment," Jack said, his voice dripping with mockery. Margaret was taken aback. Was demanding respect now considered harassment? The officers stepped out of their car, ready to teach her a lesson. They wanted her to know that they held the power, and she, an elderly woman struggling on her own, was nobody in their eyes. But Margaret, despite being in a vulnerable position, remained steadfast. She had seen a lot in her life, and she knew she deserved better than this. The escalation of their threats only hardened her resolve. Margaret wasn't someone who would quietly walk away from a situation where she had been wronged. She looked Stephen in the eye and said, "I have as much right to be here as you do. You can't scare me into silence." For a moment, there was a pause. Stephen seemed slightly taken aback by her words, as though he hadn't expected her to resist. The officers made up their minds to arrest her. Margaret stood her ground, but they grabbed her forcefully. Her protests fell on deaf ears as they restrained her, indifferent to her discomfort. They ignored her words and forced her into the police car, driving her to the station. Margaret was scared but not defeated. As they reached the station, she began to hope that perhaps someone at a higher level would hear her plea, see what was happening, and put an end to the officers' cruelty. The trip to the police station felt endless. Margaret stared out of the window, her hands tightly bound by the cuffs. She felt the injustice of it deep within her bones. Memories of her youth, when she fought for her community and stood against inequality, flooded her mind. Margaret knew this wasn't just about her. This was about anyone who had ever been mistreated because of their vulnerability. When they arrived at the police station, Stephen and Jack dragged Margaret inside, oblivious to the consequences that awaited them. As soon as they entered, the police captain, Robert, turned around and his eyes widened in shock. Standing in front of him, humiliated and in handcuffs, was his own mother. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The shock on Robert's face was palpable, and the entire room fell silent. The officers, Stephen and Jack, had no idea who they had just mistreated and arrested. The reality of the situation dawned on them like a bucket of ice-cold water. They had not only disrespected an innocent elderly woman, but they had also humiliated their superior's mother. The consequences of their actions were about to come crashing down. Captain Robert's eyes met Margaret's, and there was a deep pain in his gaze. He hurried over to her, immediately ordering that she be uncuffed. "Mother, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. His mother had always been his role model, her strength, her kindness, her unwavering sense of justice. And now, here she was, mistreated at the hands of the very people meant to protect the public. Captain Robert's initial shock quickly turned into anger. He looked at his subordinates with disbelief and fury. How could they have been so heartless and irresponsible? He immediately ordered that Margaret be released from her handcuffs and apologized profusely to her. Stephen and Jack were speechless. They knew there was no escaping the consequences of what they had done. Captain Robert did not hesitate. He dismissed them on the spot. Their careers in law enforcement were over. What they had thought was a harmless joke had ended up costing them everything they had worked for. There was a solemn silence in the room as Stephen and Jack stood there, their faces flushed. They realized that their actions, once thought to be trivial, had not only cost them their jobs, but had also deeply hurt a woman who deserved nothing but respect. The captain looked at them with disappointment, a look they knew they would never forget. This incident became a harsh lesson for Stephen and Jack. They realized too late that every individual deserves respect, no matter their age, background, or physical condition. Their abuse of power had led to their downfall. Margaret, despite the humiliation she endured, stood tall. She was proud that she had not backed down, that she had demanded respect even when she was at her most vulnerable. This story speaks volumes about the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how powerless you may feel. Margaret's strength and courage became a symbol of resilience and dignity. If you're watching this video and have ever faced a situation where you were treated unfairly, share your story in the comments below. Let's remind each other that dignity is something worth fighting for. Margaret's refusal to remain silent served as a wake-up call. Her courage was contagious, and it prompted many others to share their own stories of resilience and persistence. It made people think twice before they laughed at someone else's struggles. If an elderly woman could stand up against such blatant injustice, what could we all do if we found our own voices? Margaret's story didn't end there. News of what had happened spread throughout the community, and she became a symbol of resilience and strength. People admired her for standing her ground and not letting anyone strip away her dignity. Her story inspired many to speak up against injustice, to not let authority figures misuse their power, and to always remember the value of respect. Margaret herself remained humble. She didn't seek revenge against the officers. She simply wanted her story to be a reminder that no one, regardless of age or status, should ever be belittled. She remained true to herself, and in doing so, she empowered others. Margaret's journey was far from easy, but her determination to stand up for what was right lit a fire in those who heard her story. Local media covered her experience, and it became a topic of discussion in community meetings and schools. People began to look at their own behavior and the ways in which they treated the most vulnerable members of society. Margaret had sparked a change, and that change began with empathy. The impact of Margaret's experience went beyond the police station. It touched the lives of many people who heard her story. She received support and love from her community, and her courage became a beacon of hope for those who had been mistreated or overlooked. Stephen and Jack, on the other hand, had to face the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives. They lost their jobs, their reputations, and perhaps most importantly, they learned a painful lesson about the importance of empathy and respect. Margaret's story reached the hearts of many. The elderly in her community no longer felt invisible. People approached Margaret to thank her, to share their own experiences, and to let her know that her courage had given them hope. Margaret had not only stood up for herself, she had become an advocate for the voiceless, showing that change begins when one person refuses to remain silent. Margaret's story is a powerful reminder that respect is not something that should be earned based on age, status, or power. It is something that every human being inherently deserves. Her courage in the face of mistreatment shows us all that standing up for yourself is always worth it, no matter how daunting it may seem. At Life Tells Stories, we believe in the power of these moments to inspire change and reflection. It is easy for those in positions of power to forget the humanity of those they encounter, but Margaret's story serves as a lasting reminder that every individual deserves dignity. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in fighting for what is right, then don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue sharing powerful stories that inspire positive change. Thank you for watching, and always remember, respect is the right of every human being. Stay tuned for more impactful stories, and until next time, take care.